Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling some pretty fascinating stuff. We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy specifically, their entry on Korean Confucianism.
Sounds intriguing.
It is. And what we're going to do is sort of act as philosophers ourselves for a bit, really dive deep into how these Korean thinkers wrestled with big philosophical questions, see if we can uncover some surprises along the way.
I'm game if you are.
Awesome. So, one of the first things that really jumps out is how Confucianism, which Koreans call yuhak or yugyo, became such a core part of their culture.
Yeah, and not in a forced way at all. By the 5th century CE, it was already pretty seamlessly woven into existing Korean culture.
Blending right in alongside Buddhism and Taoism, it's like a real melting pot philosophical ideas.
Exactly. And you see early Korean Confucians taking these ideas, especially the ones about hierarchy and moral leadership, and using them to build their state and society.
It wasn't just theory for them, right? They were putting these principles into practice, creating a real tangible impact.
Absolutely. They were all about applying these ideas to everyday life, to family relationships, to governing. And it wasn't static either. As time went on, they started having these vigorous philosophical debates.
Especially during the Chos dynasty, which lasted from 1392 to 1910. That's when Neo-Confucianism really took root, and things got even more interesting.
A lot more interesting. And this is where the concept of sagehood comes in. Shungin is what they called it.
Okay, sagehood, what did that actually mean for them?
Well, it was basically the ultimate goal, like a complete moral transformation through hard work and study.
A lifetime of learning.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is their focus on self-reliance in this pursuit. They
Ah.
believed that humans had this inherent capacity to solve problems.
Less need for divine intervention, more emphasis on human potential.
You got it. So who were the big names, the guiding lights in this tradition? What were they reading?
Yeah, I'm curious about the sources too. Where were they getting these ideas from?
Well, like in China, they relied heavily on the 5 classics. Ancient texts like the Classic of Changes and the Classic of Poetry.
Classic stuff, timeless wisdom, right?
Right. And then later, they got into the 4 books, which were compiled by Zhu Xi. He was a huge figure in Neo-Confucianism. His commentaries on these texts were, incredibly influential.
I can see how that would shape their thinking. But, the text we're looking at also emphasizes that Korean Confucians weren't just passively absorbing these ideas. They were actively debating and adding their own interpretations.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't afraid to question things and come up with their own unique perspectives.
Yeah.
That's what makes it so fascinating, to be honest. It's not just a copy-paste situation.
They were real philosophers in their own right.
Exactly. Okay, so another really big theme in Korean Confucianism is the whole idea of social obligations.
Like those 5 cardinal relationships, the text mentions those.
Yep, those. They were seen as the bedrock of society. Affection between father and son, righteousness between ruler and subject, all of that.
So relationships were key to maintaining social order.
Absolutely. But keep in mind, these relationships were often seen through a pretty hierarchical lens. And it's important to acknowledge that in a lot of cases, this meant women were placed in a subordinate position to men.
That's a bit of a downer, isn't it? Like a rigid social structure where everyone has their fixed place.
Yeah, it definitely had its drawbacks.
Wha-
But the flip side was this ideal of social harmony. The idea was that if everyone fulfilled their specific role,
Right.
you could achieve a balanced and peaceful society.
It all sounds so carefully structured. And of course, the king, being at the very top, had a huge responsibility to set the moral tone.
Right. That's where the idea of sage learning, sungak, really kicks in. It was about cultivating moral leadership, starting from the very top. And they also relied heavily on rituals to maintain social order.
Like the ancestral rites, chesa, right? Those are still pretty common in Korea today.
They are. These rituals were a big part of reinforcing social norms. But it's worth noting that they sometimes reinforce those patriarchal structures too.
Right, a bit of a double-edged sword, it seems. Okay, so they stressed social obligations and rituals, but they also believed in the inherent goodness of humanity. I mean, that's classic Mencius.
Yep, Mencius was a big influence. And the idea of an inherently good human nature, sheng, really shaped their view of education.
So education wasn't about forcing people to be good, but rather about helping them to cultivate the goodness that was already within them.
Exactly. It's about nurturing that potential, not imposing rules from the outside. And speaking of Mencius, his ideas played a huge role in shaping the complex metaphysical debates that emerged with Neo-Confucianism. You see, while earlier Confucianism had a strong ethical framework, It was kind of lacking in the metaphysics department.
Ah, so Neo-Confucianism was a way to provide that deeper, more comprehensive explanation of the universe.
That's one way to look at it. They wanted to compete with the sophisticated systems of thought found in Buddhism.
It was like a philosophical arms race.
In a way, yeah. And this is where the concepts of principle, or I, and material force, keyfully become central.
Okay, break those down for me. What do those mean?
Principle? Well, think of it like the underlying blueprint of the universe. It's immaterial, it's the source of all things, it's what gives everything its order and purpose. Material force, on the other hand, is the physical stuff that makes up the world, the actual embodiment of principle.
So everything is a combination of these two forces, the blueprint and the building material.
Exactly. And in Korea, you see the emergence of this school of principle, or IHAC, which really dove deep into these metaphysical questions.
Like getting into the nitty-gritty of the universe.
Big time. A key figure here is Kun, who was writing in the late 14th and early 15th centuries.
And he had some pretty interesting ideas about principle and material force, right?
He did. He argued that principle came first, logically speaking. It was the fundamental basis of both mind and material force. This allowed him to uphold the idea that human nature was inherently good because principle itself was good.
So any bad stuff comes from material force messing things up.
That's the gist of it. And he even connected principle to those four beginnings from Mencius, the inherent moral inclinations we talked about earlier.
Oh, right. Like those feelings of compassion and shame. And material force would be connected to the seven feelings, like joy, anger, sadness.
You got it. It's a framework for understanding our moral and emotional lives.
It's all coming together now. And then there's this other influence that the text mentions, Korean Sun Buddhism. What's that about?
Right. So Sun Buddhism, particularly this idea of essence function, or Che-yang, really had an impact on Korean Neo-Confucians. Think of it as borrowing a technique from another tradition.
Kind of like a cross-cultural exchange of ideas.
Exactly. And it shows up most clearly in their practice of quiet sitting, or Chunghwa. Basically, a form of seated meditation aimed at cultivating the mind.
So using meditation to deepen their understanding and practice of Neo-Confucian principles.
Precisely. And all of this wasn't just happening in some ivory tower. Neo-Confucianism really shaped Korean society, especially during the Joseon dynasty.
It became a driving force in their politics and culture.
Absolutely. Figures like An Yang, Pi Chung, they were instrumental in spreading these ideas and linking them to education and governance. And then you have Chum Tojon, who played a huge role in establishing Neo-Confucianism as the dominant ideology of the dynasty.
He seems like a real game changer. What did he do specifically?
Well, he was instrumental in restructuring society based on Confucian morality and propriety. He wanted to implement these ideas in every aspect of life. And a big part of this involved creating specific rites for everything. Coming-of-age ceremonies, marriage, mourning, ancestral rites, all of it. They even codified these rituals into law in the Kijonguk Taejun.
Wow. Talk about a top-down approach, making philosophy the law of the land.
That's putting it mildly. And this shift also led to some pretty significant friction with Buddhism, which had been a major force in Korea for centuries.
A real clash of titans, huh?
You could say that. Early Confucian scholars like Paik Munbo, they were pretty critical of Buddhism. They saw it as being too focused on detachment and otherworldly stuff.
Whereas Confucianism was all about being in the world, engaging with society.
Exactly. And then you have Chong Tojun. He took this critique to a whole other level. He wrote these really detailed arguments against Buddhist doctrines in his works, like Array of Critiques of Mr. Buddha and On Mind, Material Force and Principle.
So he was systematically dismantling Buddhist ideas.
Pretty much.
Oh.
He challenged their views on the nature of mind, the concept of illusion, you name it. He even went after their idea of emptiness and the whole idea of seeking refuge outside of oneself.
A full-on philosophical takedown. But the Buddhists didn't just take this lying down, right?
Of course not. A key figure here is Hamen Kiwa. He countered Chong Tojun's arguments by advocating for a more inclusive approach. He called it the unity of the three teachings, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. He thought there was room for all of them.
A more harmonious vision, maybe?
Maybe so. And it shows that this wasn't just a one-sided debate. There were real back and forths happening.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Let's circle back to this idea of sage learning, or Songgak, which was so central to Korean Confucianism.
Absolutely. Songgak wasn't just about studying. It was about striving for that ultimate goal of sagehood. It involved continuous learning, self-reflection, and moral development.
A lifelong pursuit. And the text mentions two key figures who really shaped this discourse. Yi Huang, also known as Toegi, and Yi Ai, known as Yulgok. They were like the rock stars of Korean Neo-Confucianism.
Yeah, they were. Toigi's 10 diagrams on sage learning and Yogok's essentials of the learning of the sages are like required reading for anyone serious about understanding this stuff.
And Togi's 10 diagrams were a big deal, right? Like one of the most widely reproduced texts during that time.
Oh, yeah. It was basically a carefully curated collection of diagrams and explanations designed to help people understand Zuvi's complex teachings. It even included Togi's own contributions and insights, so it was a pretty comprehensive guide.
Visual aids for philosophical concepts. That's pretty cool.
It is. And for Toge, a central focus was on cultivating the mind, sim. He really emphasized this idea of kijung, which is often translated as mindfulness or reverent mindfulness.
Like a constant awareness of your thoughts and actions, trying to keep them aligned with goodness.
Exactly. And the diagrams themselves provided a visual representation of the interconnectedness of the universe and the path to moral perfection.
So the diagrams weren't just illustrations, they were like a roadmap for sagehood.
That's a great way to put it.
So then we get to the 4-7 debate. This is where things get really heated, right? It's described as like the most important intellectual controversy of the entire Chosun dynasty.
It was huge. Basically, they were debating the origins of human morality and emotions, specifically the four beginnings, those innate feelings of compassion, shame, and so on, and the seven feelings, which are more like our basic emotional responses.
And the big question was, where do these come from? Are they rooted in principle, that pure source of goodness? Or are they influenced by material force, which could introduce negativity?
That's the crux of it. They were grappling with the very nature of human nature and the problem of evil. Like, why do we do bad things if we're inherently good?
A timeless question. And what did Taegi and Yulgok have to say about this?
Well, they disagreed, as you might expect. Tiggy initially argued that principle was the source of the four beginnings, while material force caused the seven feelings. So kind of a dualistic view.
Good versus bad, essentially.
Sort of, yeah. But he later refined his view, arguing that principle was like the potential for actualization, and material force was the actualization itself. So even though principle is the source of goodness, you still need material force to bring it into being.
That makes sense. It's like a seed and the soil. You need both to grow something.
That's a good analogy. And Yulgok took a slightly different approach. He argued that material force was the activating factor for both the four beginnings and the seven feelings.
So material force was more central in his view.
Yeah, he saw it as more necessary for principle to actually manifest in the world. It's a subtle difference, but it led to some pretty heated debates.
And those debates continued, didn't they? The text mentions another controversy, the Horak debate.
Right, the Horak debate. This was later on within a specific faction of Neo-Confucianism called the Noron. They were mostly followers of Yulgok's ideas, but they still had some pretty significant disagreements.
What were they arguing about this time?
They were really getting into the weeds. They debated the precise definition of human nature, the relationship between principle and material force in the unaroused mind, what they called Meeble, and even the difference between the nature of humans and animals.
Deep stuff. And what about women? Did they participate in these debates?
They did, actually. There were a few notable female scholars, like Im Yunjidang and Kang Chongeltang, who offered their own interpretations of these complex ideas. And Yunjidang, for example, argued for a more individualized nature for different species, while still acknowledging the universal role of principle. And Kang Chongeltang wrote some really beautiful poetry about mindfulness and the path to sagehood.
So even within this very male-dominated intellectual world, there were women making their voices heard.
Absolutely. They made valuable contributions to the debate.
Okay, so are you ready for another curveball?
Bring it on.
Well, around this time, early Catholic texts started circulating in Korea. Most notably, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven by Matteo Ricci.
That must have really shaken things up, introducing this whole new religious and philosophical worldview.
It did. It sparked a whole new set of debates. The Confucian scholars were especially critical of the Catholic idea of God, Tianzu or Chunju, as a personal creator who is distinct from principle.
That goes against the whole Neo-Confucian understanding of the universe.
Exactly. Some scholars, like Yu Siguang and Yi Ekik, saw some overlap in terms of moral values, but they ultimately rejected core Christian doctrines. And others, like Sin Hudam and An Shunbok, were really worried that Catholicism would disrupt the social order.
I can see why they would be concerned. It challenges their entire way of life. But here's the thing. Some Koreans actually converted to Catholicism, figures like Yi Pyuk and Yi Seung-hoon. And what's interesting is that they often tried to bridge the gap between their Confucian background and their new faith.
Trying to reconcile two different worldviews.
Exactly. And they even incorporated Confucian ideas like loyalty and filial piety into their early Catholic writings in Hangul.
So it wasn't a complete rejection of their past. It was more like a blending of ideas.
It's a great example of how cultural exchange can lead to new and unexpected syntheses. And then you have Taozan, also known as Chong Yagyong, who was a really fascinating figure. He initially had connections to the early Catholic community in Korea.
But he later renounced Catholicism.
He did, yeah. But his later writings show a clear influence from Christian ideas. For instance, he started emphasizing Sangye, which is an ancient Chinese term for a supreme deity, as a personal creator god, which is a bit of a departure from traditional Neo-Confucianism.
So he was kind of reinterpreting Confucianism through a Christian lens.
Some scholars argue that yes, he definitely moved away from certain aspects of Neo-Confucian metaphysics and put more emphasis on theism and practical social reform. He even wrote about the importance of free will, which isn't a typical Confucian idea.
It sounds like he was trying to find a new path forward, incorporating elements from different traditions.
He was definitely a forward-thinking guy.
Okay, so then we move into the 19th century, when modernization really starts to take hold. What happened to Confucianism during this period?
Things got really complicated. The persecution of Catholics actually intensified in the 19th century, led by Confucian authorities. And within Confucian circles, there was a growing divide between those who wanted to stick to traditional principle-based philosophy and those who were more interested in practical approaches focused on K, or material force.
A kind of split between the traditionalists and the modernizers.
Yeah, you could say that. And then you have the emergence of the Tonghak movement, which was a new religious movement that drew inspiration from both Confucian and Christian ideas, but ultimately offered something entirely new. It was a pretty turbulent time, full of change and uncertainty.
So Confucianism was at a crossroads. How did they adapt to all of these changes?
Well, there were different attempts to revitalize and reform Confucianism. Some scholars tried to reinterpret it as a modern religion or an ethical system compatible with modern values. Later scholars have identified three stages in how modern Koreans have understood their Confucian heritage. First, there was a period of denial where they kind of rejected its relevance. Then came a phase of excuse-making where they tried to focus on the more practical aspects of Confucianism, like the Surhak movement. And more recently, there's been a movement towards rehabilitation, where scholars are reevaluating Confucianism's enduring contributions.
So it's been a long and complex journey for Confucianism in Korea.
It has.
Yeah.
But it's still a vibrant tradition, even today.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive. I am amazed by how deeply philosophy was interwoven with every aspect of life for these Korean thinkers.
You too. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise for them. They were trying to figure out how to live a good life, how to create a just society, and even how to understand the ultimate nature of the universe.
It was all connected, and they weren't afraid to challenge each other, to debate, to refine their ideas. It was a real intellectual ecosystem. And their emphasis on self-cultivation, moral responsibility, and social harmony, I mean, those are themes that are still relevant today, even if the specific context has changed.
Absolutely. They offer a lot of food for thought, even for people who aren't Confucian scholars.
So here's something for our listeners to ponder. Given this emphasis on self-improvement and social responsibility within Korean Confucianism, how can these ideas inform how we approach our own lives and the challenges we face in the 21st century? Can this idea of sagehood, of striving to be better individuals and build a better world, be something we can all aspire to, regardless of our backgrounds or beliefs? It's something worth thinking about, don't you think? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.